So yeah, as I said at the outset, we're probably not going to get through all of this. We're only on what, slide number 10 out of 90, and I'm going to skip quite a bit, I think, of Schopenhauer, particularly when we get closer to the end and he starts getting real detailed about all the different types of art forms. I kind of did this with Kant as well. I guess I skimmed over all the different rankings of the arts in Kant. We talked about it a little, but you know, I really skimmed the slides. But I think we actually read this last meeting, but it's a good place to start because it kind of hits at the essence of Schopenhauer's philosophy here of art and what is going on in great works of art according to him, right? What do we see when we see beautiful works of art? This is from the section in his book on the inner nature of art. And he writes, what is life? And he's got that in parentheses. So this question, what is life? Every generation and successful work of art answers this question in its own way with perfect correctness. So a work of art answers the question, what is life? Okay, so you keep this in mind throughout. This is kind of I think, a guiding principle in Schopenhauer. And perhaps this is why humans, because we have this certain type of life that we have, we are the only type of beings that we know of. Perhaps God is above us, if there is one, would also have this capacity, but we're the only ones that fully can appreciate art and beauty and see, you know, the answer to this question, what is life, in works of art. So again, what is life? Every generation and successful work of art answers this question in its own way with perfect correctness, if it's a good work of art at least. But all the arts speak only the naive and childish language of perception. Yeah, so a little bit of compliment and then kind of taking it away, childish and naive. So art speaks this language in a naive language of perception. It's perceptual. You see the answer to this question, it's correct, but it's at just the complete, purely aesthetic level. So it's not the abstract, serious language of reflection, the language of philosophy. Their answer is therefore a fleeting image, not permanent and general knowledge. Thus, for perception, every work of art answers that question. Every painting, every statue, every poem, every scene upon the stage, music answers it, and indeed more profoundly than all the rest. For in its language, which is understood with absolute directness, but which is yet untranslatable into that of reason, is the inner nature of all life and existence that expresses itself. So there's this inner nature of art, which is the expression of the inner nature of life. You know, what Schopenhauer is going to call this will that wants to impose its will and to achieve its best, most functional, most perfect manifestation of itself. This is the inner nature of all life, and it's expressed in art with absolute directness, as he puts it, and especially in music. You know, again, I probably won't spend enough much time on this since we're running out of time. But we talked about it a bit last week at the end, how for Schopenhauer, music is at the top. Remember, for Kant, it was poetry. Poetry is the king of the arts. But for Schopenhauer, music, because for him, it is the most direct in expressing this inner life. When we hear a sad song, we don't need to think about it as sad. It directly makes us feel sad. It gives us that emotion. It directly, if it's a good song, a well-constructed sad song, or a happy song, it uplifts our spirit. There's a sort of direct connection without the intermediary of the intellect or the mind, or you know, and this is very Kantian also too. That you might, you know, be thinking, this sounds a bit like Kant. You're right, to a certain extent. There's a lot that they share. But of course, there's a lot that distinguishes them, and we'll see this as we proceed. So, and this is where we really left off. I don't think I did read this quote. Art and philosophy, very similar. They're answering the same question. One does it through perception, through the visual arts, and one does it through reflection and through reason, and through philosophical treatises. All the other arts hold up the questioner or to the questioner a perceptible image and say, look here, this is life. So again, art presents to the viewer an expression of life, a manifestation of the will that underlies all. Their answer, however correct it may be, will yet afford only a temporary, not a complete and final satisfaction, for they always give merely a fragment, an example, instead of a rule, not the whole, which can only be given in the universality of a conception. For this, therefore, thus for reflection in the abstract, to give an answer which just on that account shall be permanent and suffice for always is the task of philosophy. However, we see here upon what the relationship of philosophy to the fine arts rests, and can conclude from that to what extent the capacity of both, although in its direction and in secondary matters very different, is yet in its root the same. Okay, so the way that philosophy proceeds is much different from art, and philosophy gives us universal truths. Art presents us with universal truths. You're going to see this in a minute, but only in a fleeting image, only while we're observing the work of art, only while we're hearing it or listening to it, or observing it with our eyes or whatnot. Is this truth felt and seen? But throughout art, through contemplative reflection and understanding, this truth is just constantly known and constantly accessed. It follows from all this that in works of the representative arts, all truth is certainly contained, yet only virtualiter or implicite. Philosophy is only virtually there or implicitly there. Philosophy, on the other hand, endeavors to supply the same truth in actuality, explicitly, actualiter, explicite. And therefore, in this sense, it's related as, and in this sense, is related to art as wine is to grapes. Philosophy's wine, art is the grapes, right? Art is is the living flesh, the visual representation, extract the essence and the truth from that, and wine, that the philosophy is the wine. What it promises to supply would be, as it were, an already realized and clear gain, a firm and abiding possession, while that which proceeds from the achievements and works of art is one which has constantly to be reproduced anew. I guess that's also another nice part of the metaphor of the grape and the wine. Grapes go bad. You have to eat them. You have to, consume them, and they're gone. Whereas wine, you can store it, and it gets better with age, or I suppose, right? So that's art is the wine, and its truths are true in every second and every moment. Whereas art is a truth that expresses itself as you're observing it, and then only then when you have this aesthetic experience. Every work of art accordingly really aims at showing us life. Again, what is life? This expression of the will, this underlying will, and the things as they are in truth, but cannot be directly discerned by everyone through the mist of objective and subjective contingencies. Art takes away this mist. So what is he talking here about objective and subjective contingencies? Last week, we were just really focusing mainly on his idealism, and this ties into that. He thinks that for the most part, we see ourselves as the subject, separate from a world out there of objects. And that's incorrect. For him, my will and the object are one and the same. And it's only upon philosophical reflection that I can have this realization of that, or, as he says here, through an experience of works of art. When I see a great work of art and I have this overwhelming experience, it takes away what he calls the mist of objective and subjective contingencies. I lose myself. I forget about what I was doing and why I was doing it, and I just focus on the beauty of the experience itself. I'm not thinking about, oh, geez, did I forget to pick up milk? I got to go back to the grocery store. I'm not thinking about all these tasks that I need to achieve, or the future, or a past, or regret, or anything. I'm just in the moment. Right? This is also, I think, similar to the Kantian understanding of aesthetic experience. Not, I wouldn't say it's an exact parallel, but remember, for Kant, art is experiencing art must be a disinterested type of satisfaction. It's satisfying, but not in a way that appeals to my needs and my desires, but it just simply, it makes me detached, and it loses my sense of self. And I'm able to sort of appreciate it purely aesthetically. The works of poets, sculptors, and representative artists in general contain an unacknowledged treasure of profound wisdom, just because out of them the wisdom of nature of things itself speaks. So when I see a painting of a wonderful, beautiful painting of a tree, this is the tree, the nature of the tree, the will of the tree that wants to grow, speaking to me through the art. Right? The nature itself is speaking. The artistic genius is able to bring this forth in a work of art and make it plain and clear for me to see when I normally don't. I only see a tree as in my way, or to be used for material, or it's part of some framework. But now I just see this painting of it and I'm like, wow, it's beautiful. I never just thought of it as a beautiful thing. And its nature, its striving towards growth is made manifest. Its will is made manifest in the painting, right? The wisdom of nature of the things itself speaks, whose utterances the artist merely interpret by illustrations and purer repetitions. So it's like the artist takes something in nature and represents it in an even more pure form, even more real than it was when the artist saw it. Sort of exposing its inner nature, its inner core to the observer, even more than I would if I was just walking by in the woods and noticed the tree. The artist can paint it in such a way and present it at such an angle with such lighting or whatever that it gives me this sort of response. It gives me this sort of insight. And I can see the life within the tree. On this account, however, everyone who reads the poem or looks at the picture must certainly contribute out of his own means to bring that wisdom to light. Accordingly, he comprehends only so much of it as his capacity and culture admit of. So Schopenhauer's a bit of an elitist here. One has to be sophisticated and a connoisseur to appreciate good art. So if you don't like something, it's probably because you're just a lowly peasant, right, or something like this. This is the elitism of Schopenhauer coming out, and he's not alone in this. There's quite a few of these philosophers we're studying who you could level this against. But he says, as in the deep sea, each sailor only lets down the lead as far as the length of a line will allow. Before a picture, as before a prince, everyone must stand waiting to see whether and what it will speak to him. So we have to have this humbleness before a great work of art. We can't expect something out of it. What does it mean? What does it mean? We have to just look at it and let the life, the will that's in the work and the painting, become manifest and show itself, shine forth to us, to our perception. And as in the case of the prince, so here he must not himself address it, for then he would only hear himself. Again, we have to detach ourselves from our own personal needs. Again, very Kantian. Nothing really different here from Kant so far. This also, too, this quote I'm about to read here, also you might say Kant would be aligned with. I'm not sure he really said this exactly, at least in the excerpts we looked at, but I'm certainly sure that given Kant's theory of art, he would probably like this as well. But let's read the quote. Why would I say this? Let's read the quote. Through the work of art, everything must not be directly given to the senses, but rather only so much as is demanded to lead the fancy on the right path. Something, and indeed the ultimate thing, must always be left over for the fancy. What he's calling the fancy here, I think, is what perhaps Kant would call the imagination. When I fancy something, I imagine it. And so, you know, we've got to leave something for the imagination to fill in, basically, is what Schopenhauer is saying here. So even the author must always leave something over for the reader to think. For Voltaire has rightly said, my French is atrocious, le secret d'être ennuyeux, c'est d'être dire. I don't know if I said that right? But the secret of being boring is to say everything. You know, you want to be mysterious. You want to leave something to the imagination. But besides this, in art, the best of all is too spiritual to be given directly to the senses. Another Kantian thing. It can't be explained. It can't be, you know, even broken down to quantity and something perceptible. There's some je ne sais quoi. I do know how to say that in French. But although the work of art brings you to that, this is something you know, again, maybe I'm a bit of an elitist or a snooty art connoisseur myself, because this is something that really annoys the hell out of me when I'm watching a movie with somebody and they want to know the answer to every stupid question. Why did they do that? Why'd she go in that room? Why did this guy say that thing? It's like, you're not supposed to know. You'll find out later. Like, you're supposed to not know that. It's you know, suspense, you idiot. You know, like, it's, I don't know if you have friends like this, or maybe you're like that, so maybe I shouldn't talk about it too much, because like it's really hard for me to watch a movie with someone like that. You know, it's like, this is part of art. You can't just tell everybody what's, you can't have like a narrator explaining the reason that he did this is because later what he's gonna do is he's gonna lie to her, and then it's like, dude, you would hate that movie. It'd be boring as hell. You know, you're not supposed to know. I guess like modern editing techniques, you know, especially since post Tarantino era editing techniques, where they like to start the episode of every show in the middle of the action and then work their way back and forward. You know, I guess audiences are still kind of getting used to that, but I think this has been a problem for a while. I don't think you can blame it on non-linear. Not non-linear. That's not the word. That's a sort of techie word. What's the word I'm looking for? Well, I guess non-linear narratives. But for Schopenhauer, here's finally where we're going to get to something from him where he's going to definitely be separate from Kant. You're going to see here in a minute when we really unpack what he means by an expression of the ideal or the idea. Another instance in which Schopenhauer separates himself from Kant. But this quote here, where he's talking about sketches, and when we talk about artistic genius a little bit more later on, you're going to see that he's quite distinct. I don't think that him and Kant are at all alike in this regards, because remember, for Kant, the genius works in this very meticulous way, and every little step, you know, until the work of art is complete and the fruition of the product is it's made real. It's a thing. It's finished. Once the work of art is done, it's only done after this long, grueling process where every brushstroke and every little hue was perfected and adapted. By the genius, who was the only one that could quite see what he was looking for, and as soon as it was put together just right, aha, it's over. And so this is a very meticulous, very, almost sounds like, I hate to use the word rational, but it lends itself to that, a very rationalistic, mechanistic almost process of creation. Whereas for Schopenhauer, he seems to see artistic creation as much more instantaneous and direct, like just this direct outflowing of the will. I get this emotion, I get this passion, I get this drive as an artistic genius. I'm inspired by this thing I see in nature, and I want to express it and in a work of art, and I jot it down really quick in my sketchbook. And for Schopenhauer, the sketch is closer to the true beauty, the real art, the real kernel, the what is life aspect of the art than the actual finished product. So he says it depends upon this that the sketches of the great masters often effect more than their finished pictures. Although another advantage certainly contributes to this, namely that they are completed offhand in the moment of conception, while the perfected painting is only produced through continued effort by means of skillful deliberation and persistent intention, for the inspiration cannot last till it is completed. So one reason sketches are good is because they leave something for the imagination. You know, as he was talking about in the previous, you've got to leave something open for the fancy to fill in. And so a sketch kind of, you know, blur a sketch, it allows you to fill in the empty lines. You get to fill in the blanks. But also, too, this point I was just making is that it's closer to inspiration. It's closer to that, you know, direct uh, feeling of the will in the artist. And you know that direct inspiration, as we create the work of art, it's going to dissipate, I suppose. You know, that original kernel of inspiration, as the artist is slowly and slowly painting the picture, maybe it takes weeks for him to complete it, him or her to complete it, and by then, you know, it still looks great, it's beautiful, but it's far removed from what originally brought about its creation. In a way, that's kind of opposed to Aristotle, because for him, the finished product, remember him, it's the telos, or the aim, which guides all the steps up to it. Whereas for Schopenhauer, it's more of the moving agent, the artists themselves, and this inspiration in them. I don't know if that's completely opposed, because, you know, for Aristotle, obviously the idea is in the artist, and the artist creates this work that is somehow a copy or a manifestation of that inner idea. But you know, for Schopenhauer, I think it's less intellectual, it's more emotional than it would be for Aristotle. It's not that Aristotle's anti-emotions. He wants you to get emotional when you watch a work of art, when you see a play, but the artist themselves creating it, I don't see that as essential as it is here for Schopenhauer. But more about you know, form, color, imagination. You know, again, certain works of art, sketches, leave more for the imagination. They're better. He says, from this fundamental aesthetical law we're speaking of, it's further explained why wax figures never produce an aesthetic effect. So if we're looking at little toy figurines, you know, my little G.I. Joe figures when I was a kid, or my little He-Man figures when I was a little kid growing up, you know, they aren't really works of art in the sense he's talking. They don't answer this what is life. They don't uh, they don't leave much for the fancy, because all this stuff is already filled in. You know, you don't have to fill in the colors. You don't have to fill in the shape. You don't. Your mind doesn't have to do a whole lot of work. They leave nothing for the imagination to do, as he says. Sculpture merely gives the form without the color. Painting gives the color, but the mere appearance of the form. Thus, both appeal to the imagination of the beholder. The wax figure, on the other hand, gives all, form and color at once, whence arises the appearance of reality, and the imagination is left out of account. Poetry, on the contrary, and this is where you might say he's a bit in line with Kant. Remember, this is one of the reasons Kant liked poetry the most, because, you know, for Kant, the most important thing about art is that it sparks the imagination. That's not the most important thing for Schopenhauer, but it certainly is important, as you can see from these excerpts that I'm reading. But you know, this is why poetry, right? Poetry appeals indeed to the imagination alone, which it sets in action by means of mere words. We hear words that symbolize something, and not only do we have to think about the words, but what they symbolize, right? So this poem about riding the bull home, the Zen Buddhist poem, it's not about riding a bull home. It's a spiritual, you know, Zen, you know, truth that you're supposed to think about. And so this is completely, you know, you've got an image in your head of riding the bull, but then you have to think about what it symbolizes. So there's a lot of cognitive reaction. There's a lot of what Kant called the free play of the cognitive faculties of, you know, the imagination and the understanding. But here's where, again, now we're finally getting to the idea. You know, Schopenhauer's book is called The World as Will and Idea, or The World as Will and Representation, however you want to translate. But it's the idea is one half of this two-sided coin, which can't really be ever separated. We've got the will, which we have this direct access to ourselves. We have this feeling to live, to thrive, to overcome adversity. We have that direct experience of the will. The idea is sort of the flip side of this, but it's this idealized version, and he's equating it to a Platonic idea, the Platonic form. And we have to read this quote because it's really not enough to say that, even though we have covered Plato, certainly in this class. And so I'm hoping at this point in the semester, you know what I mean when I'm talking about a Platonic form or a Platonic idea. But the way that Schopenhauer uses that concept is quite distinct. So we have to be careful here. I don't think Plato, by the way, I don't think Plato would approve of the way that Schopenhauer understands the idea, the Platonic idea. You'll see pretty quickly here when I read the quote. He writes, art's aim is the facilitating of the knowledge of the ideas of the world in the Platonic sense, the only one which I recognize for the word idea. So for Schopenhauer, whenever he uses the word idea, he's talking about the Platonic form. But what does he mean by Platonic form? Again, I don't think Plato would jive with this completely. He says the ideas, however, are essentially something perceptible. Right there, right off the bat, no way. If you don't remember, go back and review your Plato. We went over the chapter on Plato. At the very end, we learn about the form of beauty. And it's not beauty, it's not a perceptible beauty. It's not beautiful in a hand or in a sky or in the mountains or in a painting. It just is. It's not beautiful in this way or beautiful that way. It just is. But he says it is perceptible. Schopenhauer, no. What Plato is talking about is really perceptible. It is seen in nature. All things, insofar as they're striving to become a thing and be their best. This is almost, he never mentions Aristotle too much. He doesn't mention Aristotle at all in our readings, in anything we looked in our textbook. But you might even argue that this is like a mix of Plato and Aristotle. It's almost like he's like a hybrid in his understanding of the ideas. Because remember, for Aristotle, all things are striving to be the best version of themselves that they can be. You know, I'm a human being. I try to achieve eudaimonia, self-completion, self-fulfillment, flourishing, happiness, this self-sufficient state. The flower tries to blossom. The dog tries to become the best dog he can be, the most loyal, the most proud, whatever, right? All of us have this inner nature that we're given, and we're aiming towards it. Nature is a bunch of things aiming towards this high form. And so in a way, I think maybe Schopenhauer's more indebted to Aristotle than he is Plato. But he likes to think of it as, you know, all these living things that are trying to live are trying to become this ideal. They're trying to become the Platonic form. And so when we see something in nature struggling, striving with will, an animal, a plant, anything that's growing and, you know, metabolizing, and even the most base dynamic forces of gravity, you know, and strife and tension and opposition, these are all for Schopenhauer expressions of a will and representations, you know, in objects of that will, or, you know, an idea, a Platonic idea. We see it, and if we understand it philosophically, we know it's just an expression of this underlying will trying to achieve this Platonic ideal. Okay, so let me start that sentence again. The ideas, however, are essentially something perceptible, which therefore in its fullest determinations is inexhaustible. So there's an inexhaustible amount of lilies and roses and lotus flowers and humans and dogs. We keep procreating and keep trying to achieve and keep, you know, so all of these manifestations are inexhaustible. The communication of such an idea can therefore only take place on the path of perception, which is that of art. Whoever therefore is filled with the comprehension of an idea is justified if he chooses art as the medium of its communication. Another point in which he would have to separate himself from orthodox Platonism. He is certainly an unorthodox Platonist, although I think he would deny that. He'd say, no, 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 I'm even more Platonist than Plato was. I understand what he was trying to say even better than him, but he was living in Greece back in ancient times. He couldn't help but be dumb. But I, Schopenhauer, who have all this insight of, centuries of bad philosophy, besides Plato and Kant, those guys were good, but I had, all this insight, and I'm able to see what you really meant, kind of this, maybe I'm being a bit too strong with my presentation of Schopenhauer's view. This is pretty much what he says, right? He says, you got Kant, you got Plato, these guys were the bomb, but they were kind of wrong. Here's what they really were talking about. The ideas are these perceptible things. They are, you see them in nature, you see them expressing themselves in nature, and what's underlying them is will. And you have a will, I have a will, but it's all really one underlying will. It's all one big thing. And we all think that we're separate. We all think that I'm a subject, that's an object, you're a subject, there's objects for you, but it's all one big will. This big beast with all these different drives and emotions and wants, and pulled this way, pulled that way, pulled diagonal and cross diagonal. One of those drives that underlies it expresses itself in nature in different ways, through plants, through animals, through human beings. Now, for Schopenhauer, like almost all these philosophers, the human will is the highest expression of all this. It's at the top of this hierarchy. But art, and this is, again, Plato would not like this, right? Art for him it's a copy of a copy. It's so far removed from truth. But for Schopenhauer, not at all. It's about as direct to truth as you can get. If you have a great, wonderful aesthetic experience like he's talking about, this is about as close to truth as a human being can get. And it's not something that can be explained in rational terms. This is where he brings himself, I guess, back to Kant. You can't, even if you're an artistic genius, you're not able to explain beauty or beautiful things in universalistic concepts. You can't rationally explain why you made that scene in that movie drag on just a little too long. It just fit with the rest of the film. And so it has to do with form, but what is right about this form and that form might be different for Kant. So you can't really formulate it. There's no formula of formulas for art. And so he says, this is where Schopenhauer, I would say, would agree with Kant. We're only perfectly satisfied by the impression of work of art when it leaves something which, with all our thinking about it, we cannot bring down to the distinctness of a conception. Therefore, it is an undertaking as unworthy as it is absurd if, as has often been tried at the present day, one seeks to reduce a poem of Shakespeare's or Goethe's to the abstract truth which it was its aim to communicate. So again, a formulaic approach to art is misguided, is what Schopenhauer is saying here. And this, I think he would say, this is a recurring theme of all these modern aesthetic theorists we've looked at. Hume says something similar, Kant says something similar, and so does Schopenhauer. Certainly, the artist ought to think in the arranging of his work, but only that thought which was perceived before it was thought has afterward in its communication the power of animating or rousing, and thereby becomes imperishable. We shall not refrain from observing here that certainly the work which is done at a stroke, like the sketches of painters already referred to, the work which is completed in the inspiration of its first conception, and as it were unconsciously dashed off, like the melody which comes entirely without reflection and quite as if by inspiration, that all these have the great advantage of being purely the work of the ecstasy of the moment, pure willless will, right? This is kind of a weird, way of talking, right? Just pure, unadulterated ecstasy. Literally ecstasy, ecstatic, means to be beside yourself, to be outside of yourself. I know the word ecstasy is always associated with sexuality, but it literally means to be outside of yourself. You lose yourself, right? Ecstatic, right? Ecstasis. No admixture of intention and reflection. Hence, they are all through and through delightful and enjoyable, without shell and kernel, and their effects much more inevitable than that of the greatest works of art, of slower and more deliberate execution. So again, great art, the best art, the most willful art, the one that answers this question, what is life better, are these works that are more close to the direct inspiration. You know, like this sketch of, you know, these lights drawings of Picasso, where he's, you know, the camera's on, you know, they've got the lens speed on very slow, and he just takes the light pen and just does a sketch in the air, right? That's a direct manifestation of the will, and therefore closer and truer of an expression of the idea when we see it, and it'll affect us in a much better way, right? A much more direct way. What we want to affect in ourselves, and this you could argue is Kantian to a degree, but you also have to keep in mind, and I haven't mentioned this yet, Schopenhauer was quite influenced by Eastern thought, by Eastern philosophy, particularly the Upanishads, which were these very, the Upanishads, I guess I should type the title there, that's not something that's really easy to spell. The Upanishads were these Hindu texts. They were part of the Vedic tradition. They were, you know, written by the meditative monks who went and, you know, contemplated the oneness of the universe. You know, how we all think we're separate, but we're all one and part of Brahma, and all this. And so Schopenhauer is quite influenced by this, and also certain forms of Buddhism. And so it's not just, I think, Kant who has an effect on him here when he's talking about the will-less subject. So you're a subject, you still observe, but you no longer have this will to do this or that, or this need or desire. You're just a purely aesthetic being, purely immersed in the experience. He writes, the aesthetical mode of contemplation, or sorry, in the aesthetical mode of contemplation, we have found two inseparable constituent parts. One, the knowledge of the object, not as individual thing, but as Platonic idea. So I see that tree, but it's not just that tree, it's the expression of universal treeness. All trees try to become the best tree, you know, whatever the hell, right? But that particular tree, I see it in such an artistic and wonderful and beautiful way that the idea comes forth. So that's one part of aesthetical mode of contemplation, is the Platonic idea. But that's inseparable, he says, from the self-consciousness. This is the second part, the self-consciousness of the knowing person, not as an individual, but as a pure will-less subject of knowledge. So you know, I'm aware, I have this sort of awareness, but I'm not aware of myself. I'm at one with my surroundings. I'm at one with my experience. I'm not separate from the objects. And I let go of myself. I keep using that phrase, but it's about the best phrase I've got for what he's talking about here. The condition under which both these parts, like the Platonic idea, the will of subject, the condition under which both these parts appear always united, was found to be the abandonment of the method of knowing, which is bounded by the principle of sufficient reason. This is a big deal for Schopenhauer. I'll talk a little bit more about the principle of sufficient reason in the next slide. Don't want to dwell on it too much because it'll probably just confuse you more than it'll help. But Schopenhauer thinks that all phenomena, all things that exist and we experience, are understood by our intellect on the basis of this principle of sufficient reason. This is another area where he differs from Kant. Remember, for Kant, our experience is always organized by the categories of understanding. There's 12 of them, and all of our judgments are utilizing categories. Every judgment or bit of knowledge that I'm aware of, that I have, is always framed in these, within the sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Within the parameters of these 12 categories. But Schopenhauer thinks that really everything boils down to this one principle. All the 12 categories are redundant, and we really understand all things, um, all objects, and all things that have any meaning to us on the basis of this principle of sufficient reason. And when we're having an aesthetic experience, we let go of this principle. We understand it and we have this experience, but we don't use this principle of sufficient reason. And again, I'll elaborate on the principle here in just a minute, but let's finish this quote. He says, so all other knowing is under this condition of principal reason, which on the other hand is the only kind of knowledge that is of value for the service of the will and also for science. Again, different from Kant. Kant thinks that there's more to science and the will, how to guide your will, how to act, than this one principle. Schopenhauer, this is just it. We use this principle to guide our actions. We use this principle to understand things scientifically. But when we're having an aesthetic experience, we let it go. We don't look for a reason. We don't look for a sufficient reason. Moreover, we'll see that the pleasure which is produced by the contemplation of the beautiful arises from the two constituent parts, the Platonic idea, the will as subject, sometimes more from one than the other. We'll talk a bit more about this probably after we take our break later today in the second half. We'll talk about this, but some works of art lend themselves more to an idea, the Platonic idea, which is expressed in the work of art. Others more the will as subject is what is being represented or shown in the aesthetic experience. So again, beautiful always arises from these two constituent parts, sometimes more one than the other, according to what the object of aesthetic contemplation may be. If it's a painting, that might be more the Platonic idea. If it's music, that might be more the will as subject. Again, we'll be talking more about that when we get closer to the end of the lecture after our break today. But this slide, again, you guys have access to this. You got access to all the PowerPoints on our Blackboard site. So I'm not going to read the whole darn thing. I'm just going to tell you the basic version of the principle of sufficient reason. This is a very dumbed down, super simple version, but this is basically what the principle of sufficient reason says. Everything has to have a reason or a cause. So everything that exists, this envelope, it exists because somebody printed it. In this case, it was my energy company, right? My electrical provider. They wanted to charge me money, darn it, for keeping my lights on. So they printed this out, okay? That's its reason, right? Why do I have lights? So everything has a reason. Everything that we understand in terms of it was brought about by something else. And this is how we organize everything according to Schopenhauer. Now, this is, there's problems with this. Maybe he's wrong. But I think his ultimate point, you can maybe say, still stands. Whether or not he's right about the principle of sufficient reason, whether or not we always use this, and that's the only principle we use to organize our experience, that's beside the point. I think his ultimate point is, though, when we have this aesthetic experience, we're not looking for a reason. This also might be a bit like Kant. We see purpose, but it's purposefulness without purpose. We're not using it for ourselves or for something else. We're not using it to understand a scientific concept. We're not using it to explain why something else came about as the cause of something else. We're not understanding it as the chain of some other things. We're understanding it purely as its own thing, as this work of art, and as a thing of beauty. There's no reason that we need besides that. It is its own reason, I suppose, okay? And so it's a sort of will-less experience. There's no will involved. He says all willing arises from want, and therefore from deficiency, and therefore from suffering. Again, this is very like Eastern philosophy here. If you know anything about Buddhism, life is suffering, right? It's dukkha, which I think is poorly translated as suffering. It's more unsatisfactoriness. Every time you're satisfied, you get unsatisfied. It just takes a moment, right? You get what you want and then it gets boring, or you eat the food and you're full, but then you get hungry again. And so this will keeps urging you on for new things, and you're never fully quenched. You're never fully satiated. But in this aesthetic experience, one loses that. One loses that drive. One is still there and still present, but no longer feels that burden. Again, very much like I think the Buddhist notion of nirvana and the Hindu notion of moksha, of just release from this attachment to all that is a thing separate from me, that is a subject. So the satisfaction of a wish ends it, yet for one wish that is satisfied, there remain at least 10 which are denied. Further, the desire lasts long, the demands are infinite, the satisfaction is short and scantily measured out. So long as our consciousness is filled by our will, so long as we are given up to the throng of desires with their constant hopes and fears, so long as we are the subject of willing, we can never have lasting happiness nor peace. But when some external cause or inward disposition lifts us suddenly out of the endless stream of willing, delivers knowledge from the slavery of the will, the attention is no longer directed to the motives of willing, but comprehends things free from their relation to the will, and thus observes them without personal interest, without subjectivity, purely objectively, gives itself entirely up to them so far as they are ideas, but not insofar as they are motives. Then all at once the peace which we were always seeking, but which always fled from us on the former path of the desires, comes to us of its own accord, as it is well with us. So aesthetic experience for Schopenhauer is a very meditative experience. Again, I keep saying this, we let ourselves go. We become one with this flow of the universe. And at the same time, we become purely objective in the sense that we see things as they really are, not as how they are attached to my needs, my desires, my want for knowledge, my need to know why this is there and what caused it and what brought it about. It just is, and I'm just appreciating it as it is. But this is just the state which I described above as necessary for the knowledge of the idea, as pure contemplation, as sinking oneself in perception, losing oneself in the object, forgetting all individuality, surrendering that kind of knowledge which follows the principle of sufficient reason and comprehends only relations. The state by means of which at once and inseparably, the perceived particular thing is raised to the idea of its whole species, and the knowing individual to the pure subject of will-less knowledge. And as such, they are both taken out of the stream of time and all other relations. It is then all one, whether the sun set from the prison or from the palace. So the sunset, am I watching it from the palace? Am I watching it from behind bars? If it's a beautiful sunset and I'm really having this pure aesthetic experience, those are the same experience. I forget that I'm the king, or I forget that I'm in jail. I'm just a pure will, without attachment to any need or desire, just a pure experience. And what I see is just the sun itself, not this sunset on Tuesday evening, and tomorrow I got to get up for work, and then the sun's going to rise again tomorrow. Not this particular sunset, but all sunsets, right? The beauty of all sunsets. That's the sun. This is life. Right? This is the idea of, this is the perfect sunset or whatever, right? And I'm just going to see what it's trying to shine forth to me. Please don't look at the sun after you listen to this lecture. Don't be a Galileo and go blind staring at the sun, right? But you get the point. So this inward disposition, as he calls it, the predominance of knowing, just sitting back and knowing objectively over willing, he says, our inward disposition can produce this state under any circumstances. And this reminds me a bit of my own interest in Buddhism. I you know, fascinated by it as a philosophy, but I also, you know, still to a certain extent practice meditation. And I remember I used to go to the Zen Buddhist school here in Houston and do meditation classes on the weekends, and they'd always have a Dharma talk. And I remember my Shifu once saying something like, the best place to meditate is in the grocery store. And he was kind of joking, but he was saying if you're really good and enlightened and you're really good at meditating, it really shouldn't matter where you're at. You know, if you have this inward disposition, you're able to affect this calmness even if you're in a supermarket and there's all this racket going on everywhere. So certain people, I guess Schopenhauer thinks of himself this way, although I don't think he is. He was actually a pretty salty guy. He's pretty mean. If you ever see pictures of him, you can kind of tell. You're like, this dude looks like a dick. He looks like really mean. Like apparently he pushed his landlady down the stairs or something like that. I mean, this guy was kind of a dick, right? But he's like, he seems to be saying like, oh yeah, so you know, if you're a sophisticated philosopher, smart guy, you know, you can affect this. You know, you can sort of detach yourself from your will at will, right? Is what he seems to be implying here. I mean, maybe I'm reading into this too much, but he says, so near us always lies the sphere in which we escape from all our misery, but who has the strength to continue long in it? At least he's admitting this inward disposition can only affect the change for so long. You know, eventually that supermarket gets too loud, or the neighbor's dog barking gets too annoying, and you just have to go shut it up and just, you know, yeah, shut up, you dog. That doesn't usually work, trust me. As soon as any single relation to our will, to our person, even of these objects of pure contemplation, comes again into consciousness, the magic is at an end, right? We go back to living our lives. We start thinking about, you know, oh crap, I gotta go pick up cat food at the supermarket or whatever. So now we get to genius, a little bit about genius. You might have a sort of an idea of where he's going to go with genius, given what he's said so far. The genius might be the person who's able to affect this inward disposition, sure, but also is able to represent the idea in art and has this sort of direct intuition about it. This is somewhat Kantian, somewhat. I mean, I would say that for Kant, it is an inkling, it's an intuition, it's something that just nature gives the genius. But remember also the way it's executed is very meticulous and thought through. Whereas for Schopenhauer, the more meticulous, the more thought through the production of that work of art is, the more it detracts from its beauty, the more it detracts from that direct experience of the will. Most men, he says, remain almost always at this standpoint because they lack objectivity, in other words, genius. So for him, genius is a certain objectivity. It's being able to detach yourself and to experience things as they are, apart from that principle of sufficient reason, which grounds all of our other reasonings. So he says, you know, most people don't have this, and they have no pleasure in being alone with nature. That's what you need. You need to be able to sit out in the woods and just breathe in the beauty and not worry about, oh, I gotta check my Facebook, I gotta check my Twitter, oh my God, did somebody text me? You too many distractions, okay? You can't be a genius if you're that way, right? That's gonna get in the way, says Schopenhauer. They have to have company, or at least they have to read a book. Their knowledge remains subject to their will. They seek, therefore, in objects only some relation to their will. And whenever they see anything that has no such relation, there sounds within them like a ground bass in music, the constant inconsolable cry, it's no use to me, right? It doesn't fit in that principle of sufficient reason. Thus, in solitude, the most beautiful surroundings have for them a desolate, dark, strange, hostile appearance. He was a very solitary man, Schopenhauer. You might gather that from the quote I just read. But he says, it is this blessedness of will-less perception which casts an enchanting glamour over the past and distant. and presents them to us in so fair a light by means of self-deception. For as we think of days long gone by, days in which we lived in a distant place, it is only the objects which our fancy recalls, not the subject of will, which bore about with it its then incurable sorrows, just as it bears them now. But they're forgotten because since then they've often given place to others. So this is why we're nostalgic of the past, right? We're thinking of the same objects in the past. The old house we used to live in, the old neighborhood, the old playground we used to play at, the old school we used to study at, even some of our old teachers. And we tend to remember them only fondly. And they give us this sort of, chummy, just nostalgic sort of feeling. But that's only because it's the past, because we're no longer invested in it. We're no longer worried about it. It no longer has that ominous feeling. Oh, I got to go to school. I got that quiz tomorrow. My teacher's going to stare at me because I didn't study and shake her head because I didn't do a good job. And, she knows I'm smarter than that. And, we don't, that's all gone. We can just look back and remember all the good stuff, and we're not attached to it. This sort of nostalgia is something that is akin to a true will-less perception of a work of art. This is something that is interesting. I don't remember anybody yet mentioning it that we've covered so far, but if you do decide to listen to my lectures on Dewey they're already posted on YouTube, this is something that John Dewey, to a lesser extent Nietzsche, but definitely John Dewey and Heidegger, they make a lot of. They talk a bit about our perceptions of the past, our perceptions of the future, and how art, and being present, how that affects our contemplation of the past, present, and future. Anyway, I don't want to dwell on that too much because, well, he doesn't say much about it here. And we'll probably talk about it a lot more when we get to Nietzsche. And if you want to watch Dewey, you can see about it there in my lectures. But let's look here. We've got about 9 minutes or so before we take our usual break. We usually break about 1:20. But let me go ahead. Let me read the next few. Let me see how many slides I got here. I'm going to skip quite a bit of stuff about the Sublime. But I do feel like we need to cover it. So let me read. This is a very long quote. Let me read this quote. And what he's doing in this quote, he's defining the Sublime. And then I'm going to go through a couple examples that he gives in the book, but I'm not going to read the quotes. I'm just going to just sort of summarize very quickly. And then we're going to try to wrap up this view of the Sublime, and then we'll take our normal break. And then we can come back and get kind of into what I think is really the nitty-gritty of Schopenhauer and how exactly we apply this theory to particular works of art and particular art forms. But I do want to talk about the Sublime. It's not super duper important, but it's odd that the textbook did not mention the Sublime in Kant, because it really, if you didn't know any better, and I hadn't told you, and this is the first time you're taking a class in philosophy of art, then you would assume that Schopenhauer is the man to be given credit for this conception of the Sublime. But that's not true. What he's talking about as the Sublime is the same thing that Kant talks about. So this concept is very Kantian, and I just want to be clear about that. For some reason, the editors of this textbook, I guess there was already enough excerpts from Kant that they had to cut something. They cut this, but they put it in with Schopenhauer. So again, gives you the wrong impression that this is original thought, and it's really not. He's really just riffing off of Kant, adding a little bit of Schopenhauer flavor because of his notion of the will that underlies everything. But besides that, when he's speaking of the Sublime, this experience of the Sublime at least, he's talking Kantian language here. This is Kant, basically. So what is he referring to? What do we mean by the Sublime? What is the experience of the Sublime? How is it different from the beautiful? Similar, not the same thing. He says, if these objects, these very objects whose significant forms invite us to pure contemplation, have a hostile relation to the human will in general, as it exhibits itself in its objectivity, the human body, if they are opposed to it so that it is menaced by an irresistible predominance of their power, or it seeks into insignificance before their immeasurable greatness. If nevertheless the beholder does not direct his attention to this eminently hostile relation to his will, but although perceiving and recognizing it, turns consciously away from it, forcibly detaches himself from his will and its relations, and giving himself up entirely to knowledge, quietly contemplates those very objects that are so terrible to the will, comprehends only their idea, which is foreign to all relation, so that he lingers gladly over its contemplation and is thereby raised above himself, his person, his will, and all will. In that case, he is filled with the sense of the sublime. He is in the state of spiritual exaltation, and therefore the object producing such a state is called sublime. So what is he talking about here? There's a couple, maybe more, but there's two basic versions of the sublime that he's hitting on here. Both of them involve what he calls a hostile relation to the human will in general, as it exhibits itself in its objectivity. So basically, there are things who usually are hostile to me. They usually would kill me, maybe. They're hostile to my body, my physical presence. And so I'm menaced by their presence, okay? Or they make me sink into insignificance because of their immeasurable greatness. So something is so vast, so huge, just immense, that it makes me feel so small. I realize how big the universe is and how I'm just this little blip in it. That is sublime. So it's either something really, really scary, like maybe you're watching the storm from your shelter and you're safe. You're in a storm-proof window, storm-proof, whatever, and you're able to see this violent storm outside. So you're not scared. And you're able to sort of see it as this sublime thing. It's beautiful, it's overwhelming in a certain sense, but technically sublime, not beautiful, sublime. Or, again, maybe you see something so large and so vast it makes you feel so small, and it just excites that willless, you detach yourself, you lose yourself. That is also the sublime. So things that are normally horrific, and yet you see them and you're detached from them, the storm at sea, something like this, or something so huge or, out of this world that you feel so small and just detach yourself from your normal way of seeing things. So he thinks there are varying degrees of the sublime. And he says these are transitions from beauty to sublimity, I guess. And when this additional quality is strong, bold, urgent, near, weak, or distant, and merely indicated. So I'm not going to go over all these. You can read these slides if you want, or read the full excerpts from our chapter on Schopenhauer. But the point is that, I guess if you go to visit the ruins here in Cambodia, right, the Angkor Wat ruins, which are still, I think, used for temples, to a certain extent, you're just going to look at their age, and the fact that they're so old will make you feel really small and significant. The sky, the big expanse of the sky will make you feel so small, or something like this. Now, other things might be even bigger. Like he says that the experience of the desert is sublime, but not as bad as perhaps the storm. The desert makes you think about, it's desolate. There's no life here. I could die. I could be desolate. And so it's sort of, okay, yeah, it's scary, but not super scary. So if you could see it detached, it's sublime, but not as bad as the storm on the sea. That one could crush you and kill you, and it's more violent. And so if you would see that with detachment, that's even more sublime. Again, I'm going to gloss over these because it's not super important, I think, to his overall aesthetic theory, but it is important because, at least in the modern aesthetics, the sublime and the beautiful are seen as very similar. That aesthetic experience and sublime experience are very similar in the sense that they are a vastness, they're beyond categorization, they, have to do with, you know, sparking the imagination. Also for Kant and for Schopenhauer, there's this necessity of detachment, of not being attached to it. So even though we're experiencing something that would normally frighten us, we're not feeling that fear. We're just seeing it as a work of art or a work of aesthetic enjoyment or contemplation. Um, I'll read this last quote, I think, on the Sublime. Let's see, is there one more? Yeah, I'll read the last quote on the Sublime, and then we'll move on to the Beautiful, because I think that's more important for our purposes, and then we'll take our break. So let me read this quote just to sort of put a pin on the Sublime. Even the vault of the starry heavens produces this if it is contemplated without reflection, but just in the same way as the vault of stone, and only by its apparent, not its real extent. Some objects of our perception excite us in the feeling of the sublime, because not only on account of their spatial vastness, but also of their great age, like the ruins I was mentioning, or quads, right? Their temporal duration, their great age. We feel ourselves dwarfed to insignificance in their presence, and yet revel in the pleasure of contemplating them. It's interesting. Wow, people lived back then. They built, imagine what they were thinking and the religion they had and how they thought about the gods and how they worshiped and the kind of life, really, it makes us think. And we're not thinking of it in terms of, oh, wow, I'm going to be one of them soon. Like, there'll be thousands of years. People might be looking at artifacts of me and wondering, why does this dude have all these philosophy books or whatever, right? So he says, of this kind are very high mountains, or the Egyptian pyramids, the colossal ruins of great antiquity. This also, you might say, is this view of the sublime in Schopenhauer and also in Kant. You might say that this view, if it is a part of their aesthetics, if it's a part of their philosophy of art and beauty, that it is in conflict with Aristotle. Remember, for Aristotle, that if something's too vast and you can't observe it all as the whole, you can't judge whether it's beautiful or not, because beauty has to do with the relationship of the parts. There can't be too much of this or too little of that. It has to be just right, the golden mean, and all this stuff. And if you can't see the full form, the beginning, the middle, and the end, then you can't make an aesthetic judgment about it. But they seem to think that no, there's something in the sublime, in this opening expanse, this unfathomableness that is very aesthetic. That's very akin to great works of art and beauty. They're very similar in their appeal to our intellect and to our fancy, as Schopenhauer says. All right, well, let's take our break, but I'm going to read this quote to end the break, to take our break. We'll I guess we'll take about 15 minutes. So it's about 1:22. Give me like a 3 minutes here. We'll start our break at 1:25, and we'll take 15 minutes. So we'll start up again at 1:40. Okay. So let me read this real quick. Here's his definition of the beautiful. Now that we're done with the sublime, we say a thing is beautiful, or when we say a thing is beautiful, we assert that it is an object of our aesthetic contemplation, and this has a double meaning. Remember, the idea half, the will half, right? Will is subject, Platonic idea, okay? On the one hand, it means that the sight of the thing makes us objective. That is to say, that in contemplating it, we are no longer conscious of ourselves as individuals, but as pure will-less subjects of knowledge. So that's one half. We become objective. And on the other hand, it means that we recognize in the object not the particular thing, but an idea. And this can only happen so far as our contemplation of it is not subordinated to that principle of sufficient reason. It does not follow the relation of the object to anything outside of it, which is always ultimately connected with relations to our will, but it rests on the object itself. So that's, I think we've already kind of touched on this already, right? This is nothing new, but this is what he means by beauty, right? both aspects of the will-less subject is involved. That becomes purely objective, and they have this experience of not the particular individual thing, not this particular bottle of water, or this particular book, or that particular cloud, but cloudness itself, right? What all clouds strive to be, what all bottles of water strive to be, what all books strive to be. I don't know what that is, but good books, I suppose, books full of wisdom, something like this. Well, what I strive to be is on a break right now because I needed to have a quick snack, and you probably need to take a breather too. And we still have a lot to cover. I'm going to probably over the break skim through the rest of my Schopenhauer PowerPoint and try to figure out how we're going to condense this down to the last whatever it is hour of class that we have. But that's my problem. I'll have to figure that out. So give me that's 1:25, so I better just shut up. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and we'll come back in about 15. Okay, so we've already read this definition of beautiful for Schopenhauer, right? It has a double meaning, as he puts it. It means, things are beautiful if they make us objective, in this sense that we become this will-less subject that isn't sort of attached to the thing as an object for our use or for our knowledge or any other reason. And then the other part is that it's the expression of an idea. Okay, it's not a particular thing, like this particular sunset or this particular tree or whatever, but it's the expression of all those things, right? Of all sunsets, of all trees. It's like the quintessential version of such a thing. So, in a sense, Schopenhauer wants to say, because of this, that really means that everything is beautiful. Okay, how does that follow? Well, everything is the expression of a will, and so everything is the expression of a will trying to become, trying to express itself as this idea, and so it is perfect, quintessential example of itself. And so as long as you understand that and you can see each individual thing as that, you can get beauty out of everything, I suppose. As he puts it, on the one hand, every given thing may be observed in a purely objective manner and apart from all relations. And since, on the other hand, the will manifests itself in everything at some grade of its objectivity, so that everything is the expression of an idea, it follows that everything is also beautiful, right? So, remember that next time somebody tells you you're not beautiful, right? You just don't see me as the expression of a Platonic idea, all right? You're attached to the principle of sufficient reason. You're not a will-less subject. I am beautiful. But okay, now we're gonna, like I promised, I said I'd get more specific here, but we'll get specific. He uses examples from architecture, and then he jumps back into some more abstract stuff. Oh yeah, Excel's gonna use that next time. Yeah, for sure. Right. Yeah, pull out Schopenhauer. He's always gonna help you. But here's an actual concrete example of what he's talking about. How does the will express itself in architecture? How do I look at a building, right, like the inside of the Reichstag in Berlin? How do I see the will here? How does it manifest itself here? Well, I've got a few slides here on architecture. I'm probably not going to read all of them, but let me read this quote. This kind of gets to the essence of the matter. Schopenhauer writes, properly speaking, the conflict between gravity and rigidity is the sole aesthetic material of architecture. So what we're seeing in great works of architecture, beautiful works of architecture, is this conflict between gravity and rigidity, which are two manifestations of the will. If that's how Schopenhauer is going to see it. The will is sometimes gravity, is sometimes rigidity, and so architecture represents these. Its problem is to make the conflict appear with perfect distinctness in a multitude of different ways. It solves this by depriving these indestructible forces of the shortest way to their satisfaction and conducting them to it by a circuitous route, so that the conflict is lengthened and the inexhaustible efforts of both forces become visible in many different ways. So he seems to be arguing for architecture that's very ornate. That's why I chose this, the atrium in the Bundestag, or the Reichstag, sorry, in Berlin, because it has what he's kind of talking about here. You could have just had a pillar, and that would have been fine for the structural integrity of the building, but this is a pillar that is more than a pillar. It shows you how all of the elements are organized around each other in a certain way, that they all support each other in a certain way, and yet they're sustained by force, but yet they're being pushed by gravity. And so I guess the more ornate and the more curly cues and the more sorts of weird things that you have in the structure, I guess the more this interplay of gravity and rigidity is made manifest. So this is the will in architecture. The whole mass of the building, if left to its original tendency, would exhibit a mere heap or a clump, bound as closely as possible to the earth, to which gravity, the form in which the will appears here, continually presses, while rigidity, also objectivity of the will, resists. Okay. So the will is gravity, the objectivity is the actual rigidity, which I guess is in the structure and the actual material that holds itself in place. Therefore, beauty, and this is a general comment about beauty, bringing forth a point about beauty through reflecting on architecture. Therefore, the beauty of the building lies in the adaptation of every part, not the outward arbitrary end of man. So again, it's not a part of the, my sense of understanding things through the principle of sufficient reason. So I'm not thinking of it as far as it belongs to practical architecture. Like, is it a good door insofar as it opens? I'm looking at the relationship between the elements and how they're a representation of gravity and rigidity and these forces of will in nature. But I'm looking directly to the stability of the whole, to which the position, the dimensions, and form of every part must have so necessary a relation to that where it's possible that if any one part were taken away, the whole would fall to pieces. This is a bit like Aristotle. I'm starting to think, this particular point he's making, not too much, not too little, the golden mean. Every part has a purpose, a function. It's there for a reason. It supports the one next to it, whatnot. For just because each part bears just as much as it conveniently can, and each is supported just where it requires to be and just to the necessary extent, this opposition unfolds itself. This conflict between rigidity and gravity, which constitutes the life, the manifestation of the will in the stone, becomes completely visible. And these lowest grades of the objectivity of the will reveal themselves distinctly. So, it seems, you could gather from this quote that architecture is fairly low on the rung of hierarchy in art for Schopenhauer. All art is great, sure. It can all get, all great works of art, all beautiful things can, what they do is they bring about this will state in you, and they detach you, and you get to the actual truth of the matter. And it's the only thing that does that besides philosophy, and it does it in a very direct perceptual way, not in a reflective contemplative way. But nonetheless, some arts are better than others, and some are more closely tied to the will, some are more objective. And for him, it seems like because architecture is the manifestation of these very low grades of will. So will objectifies itself in gravity. Will objectifies itself in rigidity. Will objectifies itself in plants. Will objectifies itself in animals. Will objectifies itself in human beings, in our bodies. And each of those things I mentioned, they're all below the other ones. This is also, he owes debt to Plato and some of the Christian Platonists here, with this idea that there's a hierarchy of being. and that some beings are better than others. Some manifestations of will are more fully true and more fully being than others. And these are the lowest grades. Gravity, rigidity, these are just like basic brute forces of nature. They're the lowest on the scale here. When we look to, like, we're dealing with just physical matter, concrete, stone. But we get to other more dynamic art. Maybe this is a higher expression of the will. I think that's all I want to say about architecture. Yeah, I can just sort of summarize this quote here, right? So art doesn't affect us mathematically, but dynamically. So it's not just the measurements and sort of the mathematical feat of it, but it's the symmetry and the way the parts organize together, the regularity of the building, as he puts it. The adaptation of all the parts of the member. This makes us think of our own body. This is very much like Aristotle too. Each part is designed for this specific purpose, and they all fit together, and they're organized in a certain order that is functional. But in this case, it's not functional. For Schopenhauer, I think he'd be more akin to say what Kant says, that there is purpose, but it's purposefulness without purpose. At least it has no purpose for me as an individual. At least we could say it that way. One other interesting point he makes about architecture, that it doesn't give a copy. This is one interesting. When we see other works of art, like a painting will be a copy of what it's a painting of. If I see a painting of a lion, like the Delacroix painting, which I think we'll get to towards the end of the lecture, the painting of the lion is a copy of the lion, but the architect, when he builds a building, the building is the work. It is the work. It's not representative of something else. It is a direct expression, therefore, of the idea. They don't repeat as they do the known ideas that the artist lends his eye to the beholder, facilitates him the comprehension of the idea. They facilitate for him the comprehension of the idea by bringing the actual individual object to a distinct and complete expression of its nature. This is what a great building does. It's a complete expression of its inner nature, right? A finished product. Unlike work of other arts, those of architecture are very seldom executed for purely aesthetic ends. So obviously this building here that I've pictured, the Binhai, the Xinjiang Binhai Library in China, obviously this was built functionally, right? The rooms are built so they can store books and information and computers, etc. But at the same time, the architect wanted it to look nice. But these are generally subordinated to the other useful ends, which are foreign to the art itself. Thus, the great merit of architecture consists in achieving and attaining pure aesthetic ends in spite of the subordination to other ends which are foreign to them. So this is the challenge for the artist who's an architect. I want to make a beautiful building, but it has to still function. People still have to be able to use it. And so this is what makes the architect the kind of genius that can produce great works of architecture, particularly genius for Schopenhauer. Maybe I should skip this. He talks about the will in nature. I don't know, though. Maybe I skip this one, but I do have to probably read the next quote. The idea is that, when I look at a flower trying to bloom, when it's growing and getting nourishment from the soil and all this stuff, that is a manifestation of the will in the flower. When I see a dog running after a boar and trying to kill the boar, that this is a manifestation of the will in the dog. And the boar trying to run from the pack of dogs and survive, that is a manifestation of the will in the boar, of fear. That all of these are just different manifestations of this one underlying will. And when we look at art, what we're seeing is an expression of this as well. It is that very will which constitutes our own nature. This is why we can see it, because we have that will in us. We have this urge and this feeling in us. And so that's why we can see it in plant life and we can see it in animal life. It's because it's somewhat akin to the very drives that are inside of our being. So it's that very will which constitutes our own nature that here manifests to us in forms in which it manifests. Its manifestation is not, as in us, controlled and tempered by the intellect, but exhibits itself in stronger traits and with a distinctness that borders on grotesque and monstrous. For this very reason, there's no concealment. It is free, naive, open as day, and this is our cause of interest in animals. The characteristics of the species appeared already in the representations of plants, but showed itself only in forms. Here it becomes much more distinct. So when I see an apple, any apple, this is an expression of all apples. They're all from the same kind of seed. They're all trying to be the same kind of thing and their own individual sort of way. And but it's still, there's not as much individuality in each apple as there is in each dog or each member of an animal species. They have a certain character. Now, not as unique as humans, of course, because for Schopenhauer, he's no different from the rest of the tradition up to this point of Western philosophy. He doesn't think that animals have an intellect. They don't have concepts. They don't understand universals. And so they don't have an intellect, but yet they still have drives and desires, and they have a will that's much more above the plant's will. And this is why we take joy much more in paintings like the one of the wild boar hunt, the Schneider's painting here, than I guess we do with still lives. Here the will becomes more distinct. It expresses itself not only in the form, like we do with plants, the form of the apples, similar shape, similar growth, but also in action, in the way that they run and gallop, position, mien, right, facial expressions, yet always merely as a character of the species, not of the individual. This also, I think, too, he doesn't seem to think animals have their own character that's individual. They're just a member of the species. When we see a painting of a cat, it's just a representative of all cats. This might be something that pet owners will push back on, right? If maybe you get a portrait made of your pet cat or your pet dog, and you'll say, that's my Fluffy, that's my Sparky, like that's not the example of all dogs, or like the underlying idea of dogness, or the underlying, that's a really good painting of my cat. It captures his personality. He has his own personality. Not for Schopenhauer, right? He's still kind of old school with this thought, right? Animals don't have characters, and they're not individual the way humans are, but yet they're closer to us than plants, and so we get kind of joy out of seeing them, and there's similarity in their expressions, and so this is why we take delight in these works of art. We see in them the manifold grades and modes of the manifestation of the will, which in all beings of one and the same grade wills always in the same way. So plants, they're all in the same grade or the same level of this sort of hierarchy of being. What has more will, what has less will, and they all have this uniformity to them. It objectifies itself as life, as existence, in such endless variety and such different forms, which are all adaptations to the different external circumstances and may be compared to many variations on the same theme. All this life, all this procreation, all these plants, creating themselves fruit and bearing fruit, and then seed spreading, and then new plants growing, and same thing with all the upper species and the animals and humans and all this. This is all variations on the same theme. What is life, right? This will to live. It's all the same theme, but just variations, just different versions, just a remix, I guess, right? Some with a full symphony, some a cappella, some with just a soloist, some with the full guard. So if we had to communicate to the observer for reflection, for our understanding, to conceptualize, if we had to put it in words, the explanation of their inner nature, it would be best to make use of that Sanskrit formula, which occurs so often in the ancient books of the Hindus. And this expression is called the Mahavakya, the great word Tatwanasi, which means this living thing art thou. Okay, so this is what the will is trying to express. This living thing art thou, right? You are an apple, right? You are a horse. You are a human. Try to be the most human of humans, and that's the most rational, the most intellectually superior being. For Schopenhauer, he's still kind of old school with the humans are above animals because we have intellect and reason. But yeah, what is life? That's what art answers. It's an expression of this will, which tells us this living thing art thou. This is life. What I'm doing, that's living. And each individual thing expresses that will in its own way. The way of its species, if you're an animal or a plant, perhaps the will of your individual nature, if you're a human being. Right? Human beings, human beauty itself, something kind of special and unique. It's an objective expression, right? So we see someone's form, their face, right? The picture of the girl with the pearl earring, but it means the fullest objectification of the will at the highest grade at which it is knowable. I believe Schopenhauer, he might have been a deist, that he believed there was a God or a ultimate being. I would assume the will is it. He doesn't like Hegel's notion of spirit, or at least he doesn't, the way he understood Hegel. If anyone here is familiar with the philosophy of Hegel, for Schopenhauer, everything is will. Is that God? I don't know. That's debatable. Did Schopenhauer think that was God? He would be synonymous with God, I suppose, by many traditions. So what underlies everything is will. And human beauty is the highest or the closest to that full universal will that we can get to, because we're humans. And so, but he thinks that we're right below it, so we're at the fullest objectification of the will at which we can know. And this is the idea of man in general, completely expressed in sensible form. But however much the objective side of the beautiful appears here, the subjective side always accompanies it. This is kind of interesting. So when I see this painting of the girl with the pearl earring, not only is she presenting me with the beautiful girl with the pearl earring, like no matter which girl you're talking about, all beautiful girls, all young girls with this type of look, it's a type, it's an archetype, it's a Platonic idea, but also it's her, like it's her own uniqueness. There's still always a subjective side that's going to accompany these sort of portraits if they're well done. The most characteristic lion, wolf, horse, sheep, or ox was always the most beautiful also. The reason of this is that animals have only the character of their species, no individual character. Again, some of y'all pet owners might push back on that. So in the representation of men, the character of the species is separated from that of the individual. The former is now called beauty, entirely in the objective sense, but the latter retains the name character or expression, and the new difficulty arises of representing both at once and completely in the same individual. This is what's tough, is that, if you're doing a good portrait of somebody, you want to get at, the human aspect, that man in general, the ideal human, humanity itself, the Platonic idea. But also, if it's a portrait of a person, you have to get their character, their individuality, because each of us is a little snowflake, says Schopenhauer. We're all special snowflakes. We're not just defined by our species. And so, this is the tough thing to do. I had some portraits here. I guess not. Yeah, okay, I'm skipping way ahead, and then I'm going to go back. And so I got this quote on character. This is skipping way ahead, and we'll go back to where we left off. But, you've got this photo here of Salvador Dali and Steve Jobs and Che Guevara and Albert Einstein. And just so they represent, I guess so for Dali, this represents the eccentric artist, but also Dali. He was an eccentric artist in his own way, like the creative madman, the wild, eccentric, weirdo, genius, surrealist. Like that idea, that Platonic idea, the will of the weird, quirky artist who does weird stuff, but also his own distinctive style. It's a very iconic image. Iconic is a good word here. It's iconic of Dali. Same thing with Steve Jobs. This is an iconic image of Steve Jobs. Most people think of this picture when they picture Steve Jobs. It's like a real famous photo. I think Anton Corbijn, took it. I don't remember. But but it also might represent entrepreneurship, right? Like the innovative spirit, the person who has this insight. This all might be bullshit. I know that all these people I picked are very controversial, so you might have different ideas, but I'm just trying to make a philosophical point, right? Che Guevara, the rebel standing up against the man, for the people. Of course, again, that controversial historically there, but this image is also iconic of not just the rebel but him, right? Che, the character, Einstein, right? This brilliant man who also had kind of this zany sense of humor, tried not to take things too serious but also serious. This is sort of this iconic wacky scientist, but also Einstein, right? So again, I'll just go ahead and read this quote, and we'll just skip the slide when we come back to it. The character, although as such it is individual, must yet be ideal. So this is a mixing of both. Its significance in relation to the idea of humanity generally must be comprehended and expressed with special prominence. Apart from this, the representation is a portrait, a copy of the individual as such, and with all his accidental qualities, right? The weird artist, the entrepreneur, the rebellious spirit, whatever. And even the portrait ought to be, as Winckelmann says, the ideal of the individual. It's an interesting point I think he makes about, human beauty and representing it, okay? So I'm skipping around a lot because we're really getting really close on time. We're almost out of time. This is just more about, the human being is the highest grade of the will in nature, and all the other grades below it exist for its sake. This is kind of like Aristotle too, the telos, right? There's a higher aim, everything below it exists for the sake of it, and it exists for the sake of none of them. So the human is sort of at the pinnacle of all this stuff, and so the human being could only exist with these lower grades of the will. If there were no plants or animals or air, force of gravity, atmosphere, etc., all these like basic primal elements, these are what make it possible for the human being to exist, and for the human being to use the intellect, and the human being to contemplate ideas. And so therefore human beauty itself, when it is represented in art, has to take this into consideration. And this is sort of like, I guess, the issue that's at stake here. So is it in nature, right? How do we know beauty? Where does that knowledge come from? This is a question that Kant looked at, and he kind of says we don't really know where it comes from. It just comes from nature. Nature just gives it to the genius. There's no way that we could conceptualize it. There's no way to know if something's beautiful beforehand. You have to just do it, and then you see it, and you're like, yes, that's it. And only the artist does that. There's no sort of set universal rules, and yet at the same time, it's a priori. In other words, it's something that it just always is the case. It's always going to make, if it's really beautiful, it's beautiful. If it has an effect, it has an effect. But yet it can't be explained sort of mathematically. So is it something that's in nature? Well, he says in a certain sense, yes, nature is an expression of the will, and so nature is beautiful. But how does this apply to art? How do we know something's beautiful in art? You would suppose, and he thinks this is a wrong supposition, but you would suppose that art achieved the beautiful by imitating nature. But how is the artist to recognize the perfect work which should be imitated and distinguish it from failures if he does not anticipate the beautiful before experience? So this is against Hume and more along the lines of Kant. It's not that I look at all these examples of beautiful things and say, aha, that's beautiful. That maybe Aristotle might say something similar. He uses that argument for virtue. I look at behavior that's virtuous, and I see patterns that emerge, and aha, that's virtue. But he doesn't seem to think that's the case. He says, no, we just know it. We just recognize it as such. It's not a comparison we make to a bunch of different things. It has accordingly been thought that the artist must seek out the beautiful parts distributed amongst a number of different human beings, and out of them construct a beautiful whole. This is a foolish opinion, for it will be asked, how is he to know just these forms and not others are beautiful? Again, for Schopenhauer, this is not something that is known through experience. It is something that is just intuited a priori and just known directly without reference to anything else. No knowledge of the beautiful is possible a posteriori, or from mere experience. It is always, at least in part, a priori. although in a quite different kind from the forms of the principle of sufficient reason of which we are conscious a priori. So the principle of sufficient reason is something that is understood a priori. In a sense, we understand everything through it if he's right. Now, again, there's philosophers who don't agree with him. But let's just say that we understand everything through concepts. And if we didn't have those concepts, then we couldn't understand anything. And so the fact that we're able to conceptualize, to think of something as having some sort of significance, that's what makes it possible to make any sort of judgment. So the concepts are a priori in that sense. But knowledge of the beautiful is a priori in another sense, because it's not conceptual. Right? When we're talking about, what Kant called categories, concepts, these concern what he calls the universal form of phenomenon as such, the way that things are presented. For Kant, always in time and space, always under the 12 categories. For Schopenhauer, always in time and space, yes, but always under the principle of sufficient reason. In general, but when we talk about the beautiful, let me skip the rest of that quote. I pretty much got the point out. But this other kind of knowledge a priori, the knowledge of the beautiful, it's not of this nature. It concerns not the form, not the way that things appear to me, always in time, always in space, always with a certain quantity, always with a certain quality, always with a certain relation. It's not the form of the phenomenon, but the content, what it actually is. Not how it appears to me, but what appears to me. And so the beautiful is just the what. It's the thing out there, that lion that is expressing the will, that plant that's expression of the will. It's not just the form of it, which might be the case for other types of experience. This form and that form have similar forms by which I understand them. But it shows itself. It's the what of the phenomenon, the content. That we all recognize human beauty when we see it, but then in the true artist, this takes place with such clearness that he shows it as he has never seen it and surpasses nature in his representation. This is only possible because we ourselves are the will, whose adequate objectification at its highest grade is here to be judged and discovered. So in other words, we have a direct intuition. I hate to use the word intuition because that's a very technical word for Kant. I don't think so for Schopenhauer, so maybe I'm not too off the breaking the rules too much by using intuition. But we have this direct intuition of the will. We have what we call a will. We might not be aware that it's all connected to this universal will. We all see ourselves as separate, as attached to our body, and our body being separate from our surroundings, and our body having needs and desires and wants. For Schopenhauer, that's all illusory. Really, it's all will in different forms and different intensities, different manifestations. But we all have this intuitive grasp of what it feels like to have a passion, to have a drive, to have a will for. We always have this direct knowing of it. And so we see it with clearness in other things, he claims. And when we see human beauty, it's even more direct, it's even more easy. We ourselves are the objectification of will at all of these sort of lower grades and at its highest grade. And so this is how it's possible. Remember, for Kant, it's always through the artistic genius. The artistic genius is just better at representing it. The artistic genius can see what nature's trying to do and do it even better. That's kind of crazy. It's like if the painter makes something beautiful, it's better than the painting of the apple is even better than any apple. It's like the perfect ideal apple. That's what a work of art is. A beautiful work of art shows the Platonic ideal, the Platonic idea. So it's even better than the actual thing, right? These portraits, I guess, of Steve Jobs and all these figures, they're even more Steve Jobsy than Steve Jobs, and they're even more entrepreneurial than an entrepreneur, something like that. That just sounds kind of silly way to say it, but it seems to be what his kind of point is. Okay, we're getting really close to the end of class time here, so let me try to skim through as much of this as we can. So this alone, by this way alone, we have in fact an anticipation of that which nature strives to express. In the true genius, this anticipation is accompanied by so great a degree of intelligence that he recognizes the idea in the particular thing, and thus, as it were, understands the half-uttered speech of nature and articulates clearly what she had only stammered forth. He expresses in the hard marble that beauty of form which in 1,000 attempts she failed to produce. He presents it to nature, saying as it were to her, this is what you wanted to say. And whoever's able to judge replies, yes, that's it. So again, it's just this direct, intuitive grasp we have on our own will that we can kind of see manifest in other things. Like Michelangelo was the genius that saw David in that marble slab, when all the other artists neglected the marble slab and thought it was bad material. It had, it was worthless. It was a crappy piece of marble. The grain is not good. There's too many lines. You're not going to be able to chip away at it properly. And Michelangelo said, no, I see something in it. I'm going to, bring forth this object. He's the genius because he finished what nature began, I guess. That marble existed to become David. It had that will within it. This anticipation is the ideal. It is the idea so far as it is known a priori, at least half, and it becomes practical for art because it corresponds to and completes what is given a posteriori through nature. The possibility of such anticipation of the beautiful a priori in the artist and of its recognition a posteriori in the critic lies in the fact that the artist and the critics are themselves the in itself of nature. They have a will. We all have a will. And the will itself is the in itself, what really underlies what we see objectively in nature. For as Empedocles said, like can only be known by like. Because we have a will, we understand things that have wills. Everything has a will underlying it, according to Schopenhauer's cosmology. But only spirit can understand spirit. So critics are good at understanding art. They know this a posteriori. They see the will after the artist has brought it forth, but the artist anticipates it. He sees they see what is half anticipated in the material, the marble slab or whatever it is that they're using. The adequate objectification of will through a merely spatial phenomenon is beauty in the objective sense. A plant is nothing but such a merely spatial phenomenon to will. Again, right? The tomato, the artichoke, all that is just trying to become the best version of whatever species it is. It belongs to expression of its nature. Its mere form expresses its whole being and displays it openly. So a few words about grace, and then I'm going to have to probably skip. Oh, geez, there's a whole lot left. I'm going to have to skip a whole lot. We've got maybe 10 minutes left. So let's see if I can get to, well, let's say a couple things about grace, and then we'll get to this notion of ideals. Versus ideas versus concepts, right? Platonic ideas versus Kantian concepts or Kantian categories. So brutes and men require further for the full revelation of the will, which is manifested in them, a series of actions, and thus the manifestation in them takes on a direct relation to time. Thus, as beauty is the adequate representation of the will generally through its merely spatial manifestation, grace is the adequate representation of will through its temporal manifestation. That is to say, the perfectly accurate and fitting expression of each act of will through the movement and position which objectify it. I don't know if we should dwell on this too much because it's just sort of elaborating, on what he said already. So grace is just beauty through time. Basically, right? I'll sort of read some excerpts here. In every movement performed, every position assumed, in the easiest, most appropriate and convenient way, it's pure, adequate expression of intention or act of will without superfluity, right? There's no extra moves. Every move is for a reason. There's a harmoniousness to it. And this presupposes a proportion of the limbs. Very close to Aristotle here, right? Proportion, form. Kant and Schopenhauer, I think, as much as they try to be, non-teleological, there's no aim, art has no aim or purpose. they're still pretty close to Aristotle, because remember, for him, beauty has to do with form and proportion and the relation of parts. Okay, character, we skip this. Okay, now this is the last 10 minutes. Let's get through these next few slides. I'm afraid that so next week we're off, and we got Thanksgiving holiday coming up. The following week, when we come back and return, we're going to get through as much Nietzsche as we possibly can from The Birth of Tragedy, but we'll probably have a little bit of Schopenhauer left too. Let's see how much I can unpack here. I want to get through just this distinction between concepts and ideas, and once I get through that, I'll be happy. There's not much left. There's really only like maybe 2 or 3 concepts in Schopenhauer that I want to touch on just briefly, and we can save those for after Thanksgiving. They're not really that important for writing your paper. You don't really need them. We've got really the basic ideas of Schopenhauer on the table now. You can be pretty confident. If you followed everything so far, then you should be pretty confident that your understanding of Schopenhauer in general. But let's turn very briefly to this distinction he makes between ideas, his notion of the Platonic idea versus a concept. So there's a long quote, so let me get a sip of water here real quick. The truth which lies at the foundation of all that we have hitherto said about art is that the object of art, the representation of which is the aim of the artist, and the knowledge which must therefore precede his work as its germ and source, is an idea in Plato's sense, and never anything else. Not the particular thing, the object of common apprehension, and not the concept, the object of rational thought and of science. Although the idea and concept have something in common, because both represent as unity a multiplicity of things. So the concept, like the concept of bottle, okay? When I think of bottle, that represents this bottle, all the other bottles of water in my fridge, every bottle of wine that I have, every bottle in the universe, right? This is a an idea, a sort of abstract subject or category that represents a multiplicity of actual things that actually exist. Okay, so ideas and concepts have that in common. But the concept is abstract, discursive, undetermined within its own sphere, only determined by its limits. Right? So I only understand a bottle by distinguishing it from other receptacles and other things that it isn't, and how it fits into the whole framework of other things and other objects. So it still adheres to that principle of sufficient reason. It's attainable and comprehensible by him who has only reason, communicable by words without any other assistance, and entirely exhausted by its definition. So this is the concept, this is the category in the Kantian sense. The idea, on the contrary, although it's defined as the adequate representation of the concept, is always the object of perception. Now, this is not Plato. Plato would probably hate this. But for him, the idea, in the Platonic sense, is something you could see or hear or experience in an artistic or beautiful thing. And although representing an infinite number of particular things, it is yet thoroughly determined. It's not some general concept, bottle. Okay, bottle. All right, bottle. That's a bottle. This is a bottle. No, it's this freaking thing right here that I'm looking at and experiencing right here, but yet it expresses all those things. It's not just this lion in the Delacroix painting here. It's all lions and ferociousness and dynamism and what is this? The lion stalking its prey. So it's the thirst and the hunger for food that's hiding in the bushes, right? It's right there. It's visceral. It's for you. It's for all to see. It's not some generic term that hangs over all particular beings. It's an actual particular being expressing an idea. So let's see here. It is never known by the individual as such, but only to him who has raised himself above all willing. Again, that will-less subject. He's not attached to his needs and wants and desires, all individual to the pure subject of knowing. It's therefore not absolutely, but only conditionally communicable, only under certain circumstances. Because the idea comprehended and repeated in the work of art appeals to everyone only according to the measure of his own intellectual worth. Again, your will has to be receptive to this. If you're still so content on what's in it for me, and you're so attached to your ego, you're not going to be able to experience this beauty that Schopenhauer speaks of. You're not going to be able to tap in to that underlying will. You're not going to be able to see the idea that's expressing itself in the work of art. The idea is the unity that falls into multiplicity. So this is interesting. It's the opposite of the concept, right? The concept is, I guess, a multiplicity that falls into a unity. There are all these different objects out there, hundreds of them. They're all different, but I call them all bottle. So there's a multiplicity of things, and I unify them in a concept, bottle. Okay, multiplicity into a unity. The idea, on the other hand, is a unity. It's one unified thing. This particular lion, this particular painting, this particular sculpture, but it falls into a multiplicity on account of the spatial and temporal form of our intuitive. This is very Kantian, okay? So it basically, it expresses all, even though it's just this particular lion, it expresses all lions. It expresses all lions in nature, every lion that's ever been, this sort of thing. We may express the distinction between the idea and the concept by a comparison thus. The concept is like a dead receptacle in which whatever has been put actually lies side by side, but out of which no more can be taken that was put in, right? So we define a bottle as such, and certain things fit it and certain things don't. But the Platonic idea, on the other hand, develops in him who has comprehended it ideas which are new as regards the concept of the same name. It resembles a living organism developing itself and possessed of the power of reproduction. So when I see the painting of the idea of the lion, the perfect artist, the Delacroix, this awesome, beautiful lion painting, it makes me understand the lion more than I would otherwise. It brings forth fuller understanding. It doesn't reduce to some sort of placeholder, some category. It actually opens up and it brings forth and reproduces fuller and more pregnant understanding of whatever the thing is that I'm experiencing. So the concept, useful as it is in life, so concepts, categories, like in Kant's use of the word, they're necessary, they're useful, they're serviceable and productive, but these are barren and unfruitful in art. Trying to reduce things to some uniform or universal conception is antithetical to what we really want to do when we experience beauty and when we experience art, according to Schopenhauer. The idea is what we want to get at, not the concept, not some conceptual reduction, but some productive idea, some outflow of Platonic truth. The comprehended idea, on the contrary, is the true and only source of every work of art. In its powerful originality, it is only derived from life itself, from nature, and from the world, and that only by true genius. The one that can see it and bring it forth in art, can finish what nature began, or by him whose momentary inspiration reaches the point of genius. We have this momentary flash where we detach ourselves from our subjectivity, and then we can finally see the world as it is, pure will, and we are will-less, and we see the beauty. So let's see, it's 2:30 right now. He's going to say a few things about allegory, which I think we can probably skip. Quite a few things about music, most of which we can skip. There are some things I do want to say, though, about suffering, contemplation, pessimism, etc. But we're going to have to keep that, we're going to have to hold off for next time, and then we'll conclude Schopenhauer. but primarily the focus is going to be on Nietzsche. I don't know how far we're going to get on Nietzsche, probably not that far, but as long as we lay out the basics, which is really his notion of the Dionysian and the Apollonian in art, as long as we get through that part, which is the sort of the first half of the reading, I'll be happy. And if you're interested in all the rest of Nietzsche, that's also on my YouTube channel, by the way. So Dewey and Heidegger, those are available on YouTube for those interested. But unfortunately, we've only got one more meeting before the semester's over. Next week, we're off again for Thanksgiving. After that, it's all Nietzsche, finishing Heidegger. And then the week after that, your final paper's due. So it's been great all semester. Hope you guys have a good Turkey Day. I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording now and stop it.